would close both.
What we want to do is, if I ask a question, respond to it as a statement, not like yes or no's, okay?
Oh, I was going to say maybe.
Okay, that too, that's a no-no also. Okay, so if you can just give us your name.
Flora Winton.
And affiliated.
Since I was born, too many years to mention.
Okay, so you could say, I've been affiliated with Temple Bethel since, like that, okay?
Since I was born. I've been affiliated with Temple all my life. My parents belonged. So I was literally born into the Temple family.
Sure. What are your earliest memories of Temple Bethel?
Lots of early memories. Childhood memories, teenage memories, and then after the war, when we all came back to the city, Temple became the focus of our social life and our fun life. When I was young and dating age, Young People's Society is where all of us met. There was just the one Reformed Temple in the city, and we came here, we socialized together, we played together. Then the war came along, and after the war, we came back to Temple, where we formed our social groups, the Temple Players, our community service, our Temple service, and most of my generation, I would say that many of the marriages came out of the Temple Young People's Society.
Now, who are some of the people you remember from those days?
Many of my friends are still here. Well, there's Phyllis Wertheimer, who was Phyllis Schoenfeld, the Prentice Girls, Stanley Clamage is one, Buddy Gordon, Herb Kramer. I could go on and on and on because we were a very large group, and you certainly don't want a litany. In my confirmation class, the year I won't give, there were 126 of us, and many of us have remained lifelong friends. And our children are friends.
That's great. Interested in volunteer contributions in the community and what you were involved with and what you got started.
Well, how did I get started? It was very interesting. My junior year in college, I was a semester ahead of myself, which meant that I would have graduated as a senior in January. And in those days, you walked in the dean's office, he said, "So glad you made it," handed you your sheepskin, and out you went. And I was determined that I was going to march down the aisle in a cap and gown. So I left school the second semester, came home, and a girl with whom I'd grown up, her aunt, Dr. Icy Macy Hubler, headed the research department of Children's Hospital and the Children's Foundation. And I went over to her and said, I must do something. She said, go over to the College Women's Volunteer Services. At that time, they were officed in Merrill Palmer School. And she said, what would you like to do? And I said, I do not know. I became a volunteer at Children's Hospital Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in medical and surgical clinics. And I worked there every day. And then from that, I went on to other community services, American Cancer Society, Detroit Public Library, where I spent 1 year in the rare book department polishing all the rare books, all the leather bindings, a fascinating experience. I worked with Red Cross as a lecturer. Then came the war, and that's only a minimal of what I was doing in the community. Came the war, and they had what was called the AWVS, the American Women's Voluntary Services. We were in uniform. We were certified by the United States government to teach both civilian defense and fire prevention, and we had an office in the old Ford building, and I taught there, ran the office. We did fingerprinting for the entire community and so on and so on. And then I was married, and I traveled for 5 years with my husband throughout the 2nd Air Force, where I had some wonderful experiences. In Topeka, Kansas, I went into the Civilian Defense Office and volunteered my time. And Mrs. William Menninger of the Menninger Clinic directed the office. She sort of adopted me, and I spent some wonderful months working with them. I always worked in volunteer work, and when I came home after the war, I went back into community work. I was a scout leader, a Brownie leader. I worked at the DIA, among the founding group of the American Archives.
I want to talk about that just a second.
Shed.
Talk a little bit about the archive at the DIA. Could you Maybe get back into how that got put together.
Yes, Larry Fleischman at one time had a group here called the Art Adventurers. We met once a month in homes, studying art, lecturing on art, bringing in dealers from New York, who in those days were sort of traveling salesmen with their art projects. They'd bring in paintings, we'd study them, we'd lecture them, we'd buy them. And Larry decided we had to do something beyond that. And he held a meeting at the home of Reba Schwader, Bill Wolfenden, Mr. Richardson, the whole staff of the DIA came, and Vincent Price was our lecturer that day. And as I've mentioned before, I was sitting with Bill Wolfenden, and he was mumbling, how am I going to afford this? I cannot do it. And I said, Bill, how about a volunteer? Answer, we don't have them at the DIA. I said, well, you do now. And I became the only volunteer in the archives, which became, as you know, at the American Archives. We started in the basement under the old library, which was next to the present Kresge Court. I had a desk down there and a wonderful couple of years unpacking the Macbeth collection and all collections that were donated. And believe it or not, in those days, you opened them up, you unpacked them, and you put them on 3x5 cards. There was no microfilm, microfiche, none of it. We did it by hand, and it was a wonderful experience. And
I'd like to talk again about the DIA and how that whole thing got started, starting with the art program here.
the art program where?
You mentioned that there was an art program at Temple.
No, it was not at Temple. It had nothing to do with Temple. It was Larry Fleischman and Barbara Fleischman who started it on their own. It had no connection with any institution whatsoever.
Okay.
It was just a group of art lovers getting together.
Okay, so start from there.
All right, just a group of art lovers getting together, learning, studying, and buying art under the tutelage of Larry and Barbara Fleischman. And then he did bring in Vincent Price for a lecture at the home of Reba Schwader, a well-known artist here in the city in her day. And the whole DIA staff was there because Larry's dream was to form an archive of American art. And that day, we pledged to start it. And it started out with one paid worker, a lady whose name I have forgotten, but they brought her here from Philadelphia. She was an archivist. And I became the only volunteer at the DIA at that time, working in the archives, unpacking these wonderful treasures that were coming in, putting the information on 3x5 cards, filing it away, and being very, very honest and honorable because the work that I saw from Macbeth galleries and the other galleries in New York were priceless. We had a wonderful, wonderful time doing it. And that was the beginning of what today you know as the National Archives of American Art.
Now, when you were unpacking, what was your favorite treasure of all of the things that you
Well, actually, we did not get as many artifacts as we were getting papers. For instance, I opened one box, and it was full of wrapping paper. It was a small box, and in a big box, and it had wrapping paper. And I thought, this is rather stupid. And I opened it up, and their sketches signed Winslow Homer. It was things like that that made it extremely exciting, because newspapers, he would sketch wherever he was. And then, of course, we did get watercolors and so on and so forth of many of the Ashcan school. But I think that the Winslow Homer box, to me, was the most exciting box I opened.
All right, that's great. That's great. What about the Birmingham Art Association?
The BAA started, I believe it was in the 70s. Harold Mackes and his wife, my husband and I, two artists.
I'm going to step you back a little bit because I know it got started a little before that.
The BAA?
Yeah.
Well, maybe it was the 60s then, or maybe the 50s.
When Ken Gross came in, it was like 72 or 73.
Well, maybe it was the 60s then.
Because I know that when he came in, the building was all ready over there on Cranbrook Road.
Oh, no. Then it had to be in the 50s.
Okay.
Well, I moved to Birmingham in 55, so it may have been the late 50s.
Okay.
Donald Buby and Malcolm Moran were the two artists that we had working with us, and another group of persons whose names have left me. You're probably correct. It was probably in the late 50s.
Okay, well, why don't we start there again?
All right.
We have our chronology.
All right. In the late 50s, a group in Birmingham headed by Harold Mackus and his wife, Donald Buby, and Malcolm Moran, who were artists, myself, my husband, a whole group of us. We started in a storefront on Woodward Avenue in downtown Birmingham. And we were going to have a local museum. And we started it that way. And then we did buy the building, which was a sewage building, as I recall, on Cranbrook Road. And hours and hours rebuilding and repainting and opening it up as a Bloomfield Art Association. And it was through that group that the Art in the Park started. Our first few years, we were Art in the Park, and my job at that time, I chaired the performing art and display group that went in, and we started it, and today you know what Shane Park, Art in the Park has become. But everything started very small with just a small group of very dedicated volunteers, and I was privileged to be in on the ground floor of most of these organizations. It was fun.
Now, I want to hear about meeting at the Meadowbrook Hall, going to tea with Mrs.
When Mrs. Wilson gave the grounds and all for what became Oakland University, it was not Oakland University in the beginning, a group was started called the Continuum Center, and it was a center for women primarily, educationally, support groups, statistical studies that were needed by the universities. And I went out there, I was called actually, and I don't remember who called me, to set up a volunteer placement bureau because they needed it. They had no money for help. Mrs. Wilson was alive at the time. She did not live in the big house. She lived in what she called the small house, relatively speaking. And she would invite us for tea and for meetings at her home, and once in a while for a luncheon. She was a little tiny woman, a very gracious lady, and it was a delight. And again, I was on the ground floor of what has become an adult study program at Oakland University. Woody Varner was then head of the university, and we used to meet at Woody's home because we had no other meeting place. And the university, as you see it today, didn't exist then. It was just a couple of small buildings. And of course, what has become of Oakland University is history. It's one of the best in the state. You didn't pick that up.
Well, let's talk about that then. So how about your activities in Temple and your involvement?
You ready? No?
We rolling? Okay.
I have been active in Temple since I came back to Detroit in 1946. I became very active at Temple, and I remember when Rabbi Glazer started the Ministers' Luncheon, which is now the B. Benedict Glazer Institute, named for him after he had passed away. And it was one of the early ecumenical institutes in this city. And you want memories of it? The sisterhood in those days were the cooks. And we stood in the kitchen making the hamburgers and cooking the meats and doing the serving. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I'm sure you're all aware of what it has become today, one of the largest meetings of intercongregational ministers, rabbis, Muslim leaders, everyone come here one day a year for the B. Benedict Glazer Institute. In working with Temple, I've served both here at Temple, on practically every committee in the Temple. One of my big contributions, in my mind, was the year that Irving Katz died in 1979. He had been our administrator here for over 40 years. And I was given the job for 1 year, volunteer. But I worked here at Temple every day that year, and we managed to get through a very rough year. I have been president of Temple for 2 years. I was president of the Sisterhood for 2 years. And in that involvement, I was also district president of the Sisterhoods, District 11. I've served on the national board of Sisterhood for 4 years, where I served as vice chairman of Peace and World Relations. I served in religion and education. I served on the Commission for Aging, and I also served on the national board, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which is our overall board of all the Reformed congregations. I served there, I believe it was 4 years, and again I was on the task force there for aging, for social action, for education, and I think 1 or 2 others which I have forgotten. but they were most memorable experiences in every way. Temple Bethel, when I was growing up, was the only Reformed temple in the city. And we were very, very busy and active socially in the community. We still are, although we're no longer the only Reformed temple. And I've always played a very active part in all of this. And we're very proud of Temple Bethel's contributions and of the persons who have been here, both the rabbinic staff and the lay staff. And the lay volunteers here have been very active in the community over the years.
If you were to pick out one contribution or one experience in Temple that sort of shines for you, what would that be?
Well, I think the year I worked as an administrator, and then a couple of years ago, I walked into the religious school office one morning, and I said, I have an idea. I'd like to start a junior readers program. And Bob Lask, who was then the educational director, said, define, please. And I said, well, I'll tell you what. I'd like to take the kids in grades 2 through 6 and break it into 2 semesters. And they must read and report on 5 books. 3 must be from the Temple Library to get them used to using it, and 2 may be anything else. They have to be either of Jewish content or by a Jewish author. But the children must write the report. And then at the end of the semester, I will have a party for them. They will receive special gifts. Every book that they choose will be their personal book. It will be inscribed to them. We'll have a party. He said, it'll never go. I said, why? It isn't going to cost you anything. Try it. He said, okay, you have one Sunday. So on a Sunday, every 20 minutes, they brought different kids into the library, and I sat them on the floor. Horrors. The teacher said they must sit in chairs. I said, no, they sit on the floor. So now I have the kids on my side. So then I told them about it, and the reaction was utter boredom. I said, well, fine. One thing you have to remember. Number one, you don't have to like the book. You may write a report and say, I hate the book. I hated everything about the book. Oh. Secondly, the day of the award ceremony, you all come here dressed. You may bring an audience. You have cookies, you have milk, you have your award, and you can take your cookies and milk back to class and eat it in front of all the other kids that didn't take part in the program. Well, I thought the teachers were going to faint that away, but that happened. And every year it went from about 20, 30, 50, huge. Almost every kid in those classes did it. And we awarded the books, and they came dressed that Sunday morning, and they didn't have to show up in class, and they loved it. The program lasted for 3 years, and then there was a change in the educational director, and he decided he didn't want the program anymore. But I understand that this year it's going to be reinstated, although I've turned it all over now to the religious school. I'm no longer a part of it. But I think that was the fun years, and I loved the looks on the faces of those kids.
That's great. That's great. You said that you grew up in the temple. Are there any stories that you were told by your parents about being here, or when they, do they have anything to say about it? Or?
About what, from their perspective?
Yeah, their memories of it. Is there anything that strikes you as like a funny story? Or
Relating to my relationship to the temple?
Well, I guess I'm looking at like that continuity or that history. Are there things that they may have said that about their involvement, or special things that happened with them as far as in the temple?
No, no.
I guess what I'm looking at is that you've been incredibly involved in volunteer activities.
Oh, now if you're speaking of volunteer activity, that's something else.
But I guess I'm looking at that. Is that something that was passed down from?
Oh, now you're speaking of volunteer activity. Mm-hmm. Yes, that has always been a part of the family. My father, in the 20s, gave what was then called the Jewish Orphans Home on Rowena Street, and he gave a home for that. they have always been involved. During the Second World War in Dearborn, Daddy had a hotel there, and it just was being refurbished. And he heard somehow through the grapevine that they were moving in all of the workers from all over the country to Willow Run, and they had no place to live, and they were coming in families. Some of them were living in tents. They were just out on the street. So instead of turning it into a hotel, he called up whomever he called and said, listen, let them come here. And for the full amount of $6 a week, they could move in. And if it was a large family and needed more than one room, it was $13 a week. And they set up a dining room and everything, and families were living there until they could be resettled elsewhere. But in Pittsburgh, where we had, my dad, not we, had businesses, they were very involved in the community. And those were the days of orphan homes, which I hope you young people never experience. But they did a great deal of work in that. And my mother always did volunteer work. And I never knew or realized, truly and honestly, until I was an adult, that when we used to go with my mother to all of these houses giving out happy, happy baskets that we were delivering to poor people. I never realized it, because if we went in, we played with the kids, and Mother was just delivering groceries. I didn't realize it was an organizational volunteer thing that she was involved in, and I really mean I was a teenager before I realized that what we were doing was giving to poor people food baskets and clothes and things like that. One funny story. My mother was president of an organization here called Home Relief Society, which is defunct now, but in those days it worked with the various social organizations in the city. They were on call 24 hours a day. Herman Garden at that time was very low income. They could call you at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, we have a family that are cold and have, and I remember one morning in a snowstorm, my mother coming into my bedroom and pulling my comforter and my blankets off and waking my brother up and telling him to get dressed. And I said, and what is happening? I am freezing. She said, turn up the heat. I have a call for Herman Gardens. I have to take bedding out there. So that went my bedding to Herman Garden. And then I came home from college one time, and I opened my closet, and I was slightly depressed. Much of my clothing had disappeared. Two of the families being taken care of by Home Relief were having weddings, and the girls of memories gone by, I was a size 6 then, needed size 6 clothes. And Mother said, no problem, they'll have a trousseau. It was my clothes. And my clothes went. We have always been involved in social action and volunteer work, yes. But those are, I could tell you some really funny stories of things that happened during the volunteer years with my parents. The time my father had, my dad was a very big man. He had his clothes tailor-made. He came in from New York and opened his closet, and he said to my mother, who was a little tiny woman, 4'9" and a half, and she had big, big blue eyes, and she used to go, yes. And he said, didn't the tailor deliver my suit and coats? I don't know. Well, did they? Well, I don't know. He called the tailor, and they said, yes, we did, Mr. Miller. Your clothes were delivered 2 days ago. Somebody knocked on the door and said, the social service sent us over here. We need something to wear. My mother said, well, here. She just took it out of the closet. You had to be very careful in our house, because you never knew what Mother was going to give away. And she did give away, but it was fun. We've always been involved in volunteer work, yes.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I think we're all set. Is there one final thing that you would like to say? Do you have like words of wisdom that we can plug in?
Well, I think at the moment, as far as Temple is concerned, one of my serious projects here right now is to modernize our archives. We have one of the finest collections in our archives, but we really should get it on computer, and we really must modernize it. And hopefully within the next year, that's what I'm going to be able to do. I have some volunteers who are willing to help, and I have some people who have promised to help to underwrite it. And it's something that we must preserve, because many of the other organizations in the city, when they need relevant information, because we were founded in 1850, of those years and up, whether it be related to Jewish concerns or communal concerns, we have it upstairs. So it's going to be, hopefully, my next big project.
Great, thank you.